The pen hovered above the paper. No one spoke. The attorney's hand stiffened slightly, as if he had expected resistance, questions, something to slow the moment down. Across the table, Naomi Carter sat perfectly still, her posture composed, her fingers resting flat against the edge of the desk. Her wedding ring caught the light once as she shifted her hand, just enough to slide it off and place it beside the document. She signed. The sound of ink against paper was soft, almost polite, too quiet for what it ended. The assistant across the room inhaled sharply, then stopped herself. Naomi didn't look up. She capped the pen, aligned it carefully with the folder, and stood. She smoothed her skirt once, not nervously, not for anyone else, just a small, habitual gesture, the kind you make when you're done. "Mrs. Carter," the attorney began. Naomi offered a brief nod. Not dismissal, not defiance. Closure. She walked out before the sentence could finish forming. The hallway swallowed her footsteps, carpet thick enough to erase sound. The doors closed behind her with a muted click, sealing in confusion, expectation, unfinished thoughts. She pressed the elevator button once, waited, breathed. When the doors opened, she stepped inside, alone. Outside, the city moved on without noticing. Traffic flowed. A street vendor laughed. Somewhere, a phone rang and kept ringing. Naomi paused on the sidewalk, sunlight warming her face, and for the first time in years, her shoulders lowered. No announcement, no explanation, no looking back. Weeks later, a yacht gleamed against open water. White, immaculate, impossible to ignore. Laughter drifted across the deck. Crystal glasses clinked. Conversations rose and fell in practiced elegance. Then, without warning, they stopped. Naomi stepped aboard. She wore no statement jewelry, no designer spectacle, just a simple linen dress, her hair loose at her shoulders, her expression calm enough to unsettle people who had expected something else. Anger, regret, desperation. Whispers moved faster than the tide. She didn't search the crowd, didn't brace herself. Near the railing, Julian Hayes turned from the horizon, sensing movement rather than sound. His gaze met hers, steady and unhurried. No surprise crossed his face, only recognition. "You came," he said. "I did," Naomi replied. No apology, no explanation. The water stretched endlessly behind them. Naomi didn't tell anyone where she was going after she left the law office. She didn't call a friend. She didn't sit in her car and cry. She walked 3 blocks, turned down a side street she'd never noticed before, and stopped at a cafe that smelled like citrus cleaner and burnt espresso. The place was half empty, mid-afternoon quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't ask questions. She ordered tea she didn't really want and sat by the window. Her phone buzzed once, then twice, then again. She turned it face down without reading a single notification. For years, she had believed that explaining herself was a form of kindness. That clarity required context. That if people truly understood her reasons, they would respect them. What experience had taught her, slowly, painfully, was that some people didn't want understanding. They wanted access, control, the comfort of believing they had been consulted, even when the outcome remained the same. Naomi lifted the teacup with both hands and let the steam warm her face. This was what choosing herself felt like. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just steady. The marriage hadn't begun as a mistake. That truth mattered to her. When she met Richard Carter, she had been exhausted in a way that ambition doesn't fix. She was successful on paper, educated, accomplished, reliable, but tired of carrying decisions alone. Richard arrived like an answer. He was decisive, wealthy, certain. He didn't ask what restaurant she preferred. He chose one. He didn't debate future plans. He outlined them. At the time, that certainty felt like relief. He told her she was refreshing, calm, grounded, easy to be. No one had ever praised her for being demanding. At first, she believed they balanced each other. She softened his edges. He provided structure. When he interrupted her mid-thought, she assumed enthusiasm. When he finalized plans without consulting her, she told herself he was just efficient. When she hesitated to voice an opinion, she called it compromise. Compromise, she learned later, only works when both people are giving something up. By the time she realized she was the only one bending, it had already become her role. At dinners with investors and board members, Naomi smiled and nodded while Richard spoke over her, finishing sentences she hadn't asked him to complete. When she corrected him gently afterward, he laughed it off. "You're too sensitive," he'd say, fondly. "You know how these rooms work." She did know. She knew that the women who lasted were the women who adapted, the ones who didn't challenge, didn't disrupt, didn't ask to be centered. She knew how to make herself agreeable without disappearing completely. At least, that's what she told herself. But disappearance isn't always obvious. Sometimes it looks like politeness. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like waiting your turn so long that your voice forgets how to interrupt. The house grew larger. Her calendar grew fuller. Her opinions grew quieter. Richard didn't forbid her from anything. He didn't have to. His expectations were unspoken, but absolute. Dinners ran late. Weekends filled with obligations. Decisions were made for the good of the family, even when she had not been consulted. When she finally said something, really said something, it wasn't an argument. It was a request. "I'd like to be included in decisions that affect my work schedule," she'd said, sitting across from him at the kitchen island. Calm, measured, reasonable. He smiled, the way you smile at a child, asking a question you've already answered in your head. "Trust me," he said. "I know what I'm doing." That was the moment, not because the words were cruel. They weren't. Not because his tone was harsh. It wasn't. It was because she suddenly understood what they meant. They meant, "I don't see you as an equal partner in this life. They meant your input is optional. They meant your agreement is assumed. Something in Naomi went quiet then. Not defeated. Finished. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't bring it up again. Instead, she paid attention. She noticed how often she pre-approved her own disappointment. How often she adjusted expectations before they could be ignored. How frequently she told herself that love was about endurance. That belief hadn't started with Richard. It had started years earlier, in her parents' kitchen, where her mother cooked and cleaned and absorbed every inconvenience with a smile. Marriage isn't about happiness, her mother used to say. It's about commitment. Naomi had taken that lesson seriously. Her father rarely argued. He believed peace was the absence of noise. Naomi learned that silence was a virtue, that voicing discomfort disrupted harmony. By 19, she had already internalized the idea that being easy to love meant being easy to overlook. At school, teachers praised her for not causing trouble. At work, supervisors praised her flexibility. In relationships, men praised her understanding. Every compliment carried the same message: don't change. So she didn't. Not until staying the same started to cost too much. The decision to leave wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by alignment, by the slow realization that she could not continue to abandon herself and still call it love. The lawyer had asked if she wanted to reconsider, if she wanted time, if she was sure. Naomi had nodded once. She was sure. At the cafe, her tea had gone cold. She didn't mind. She paid the bill, stood, and walked back into the city with no clear destination. That night, she slept better than she had in years. The shock didn't come immediately. It came weeks later, when word spread faster than truth ever does. People reached out with carefully worded concern. Some were genuinely confused. Others were offended on Richard's behalf. A few hinted that she had thrown away something irreplaceable. Naomi listened. She thanked them. She explained nothing. In the quiet that followed, she rebuilt. She returned to her nonprofit work with renewed focus, setting boundaries she hadn't known how to name before. She declined invitations without apology. She stopped volunteering for emotional labor that went unacknowledged. At first, the discomfort was sharp. Saying no felt like failure. Choosing herself felt selfish. Then it started to feel honest. It was during one of those projects, a temporary logistics partnership, that she met Julian Hayes. Their first interaction lasted less than 10 minutes. He introduced himself without preamble, listened without interrupting, and asked clear questions. When Naomi explained her availability, he didn't negotiate it down. He adjusted his expectations. Instead, no raised eyebrows, no subtle pushback, just acceptance. The absence of friction startled her. They worked efficiently, professionally. When disagreements arose, they discussed them without posturing. When she declined an invitation to dinner, after a late meeting, he didn't insist. "Another time," he said easily. She noticed how calm she felt around him, how little she felt the need to perform. Weeks passed, then months, when he eventually invited her to join a small gathering on his yacht. "Casual," he said. "No pressure." She hesitated, not because of him, but because she was still learning to trust ease. He didn't follow up. He didn't persuade. When she said yes, days later, he thanked her and left it at that. And now, standing on the deck with the ocean stretching endlessly around them, Naomi understood why the moment felt so steady. It wasn't because she had moved on quickly. It wasn't because she had something to prove. It was because she had stopped negotiating her worth. Julian stood beside her, not crowding her space, not claiming her presence. Just there. The yacht drifted forward, unbothered by whispers, by assumptions, by the past, and for the first time in a long while, Naomi felt anchored, without being held down. The yacht moved the way confidence does, quietly, without needing approval. Naomi leaned against the railing, the breeze lifting strands of her hair, salt settling faintly on her skin. She hadn't expected this feeling. Not relief, not vindication, something calmer, as if her body finally trusted the direction her life was moving in, even if her mind was still catching up. Behind her, conversations resumed, though more cautiously now. Laughter returned in fragments. People adjusted, the way they always do, once the initial shock passes and curiosity replaces surprise. Naomi didn't turn around. She didn't need to see their faces to know what they were thinking. Why is she here? How is she standing so calmly? Did she plan this? She hadn't planned anything except honesty. Julian rested his forearms on the railing beside her, leaving enough space that she didn't feel crowded. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't narrate the moment. He simply stood with her, facing the water, as if this were the most natural place for both of them to be. "I can have them bring something to drink, if you want," he said after a while. "I'm fine," she replied. "Thank you." He nodded, accepting the answer without reading into it. That, Naomi realized, was still new to her, being believed the first time she spoke. In her marriage, every preference had felt like a negotiation. If she said she was tired, it meant convincing someone she deserved rest. If she said she was uncomfortable, it meant defending the legitimacy of discomfort. Even happiness came with questions. "Are you sure? Why now?" Standing here, with the sun lowering and the water darkening into softer shades of blue, she felt no pressure to justify herself. The yacht glided past the shoreline, the city pulling away slowly, buildings shrinking into silhouettes. Naomi watched the distance grow and felt something else loosen inside her. A quiet grief she hadn't allowed herself to feel yet. Leaving had been necessary. It had also been costly. There were nights she still reached for her phone out of habit, moments when she remembered a shared joke, a routine, a life she had once believed would last. Ending a marriage, even a lonely one, meant grieving the version of yourself who had tried so hard to make it work. People often assumed strength erased sadness. Naomi knew better. Strength simply made space for it. She thought of the first few weeks after the divorce became public. The messages disguised as concern. The subtle accusations wrapped in politeness. You seemed so happy. He did everything for you. Marriage takes sacrifice. She had nodded through those conversations, too tired to argue with narratives that didn't include her inner life. It was easier to let people keep their simplified versions of her story than to educate them on nuance. Nuance had never been valued in her marriage. "Do you ever notice," Julian said, still looking at the water, "how people get uncomfortable when someone refuses to explain themselves?" She turned toward him, surprised. "Yes," she said after a pause. "Very much." He smiled faintly. "It makes them question their assumptions." She studied him then, not with suspicion, but curiosity. His tone wasn't probing. It wasn't performative. It was observational, as if he were naming something he'd noticed and inviting her to see it too. "I think," he continued, "we're used to women either defending their choices or apologizing for them." Silence disrupts the script. Naomi exhaled slowly. "That script has been expensive." He nodded. "It usually is." The simplicity of the exchange settled warmly between them. No grand declarations. No attempt to bond through shared wounds. Just recognition. As the yacht slowed near open water, Naomi became aware of how grounded she felt in her body. Her feet were steady. Her breathing was even. This wasn't adrenaline. This wasn't rebellion. This was alignment. She had spent years believing that self-respect was something you earned after proving your loyalty. Now she understood it worked the other way around. Julian excused himself briefly to check on something below deck. Naomi remained where she was, alone again, watching the sun dip lower. A memory surfaced uninvited. Her mother standing at the sink late at night, scrubbing an already clean plate. "Good marriages last because someone learns to endure," her mother had once said. Naomi had believed her. What no one had told her was that endurance without voice eventually turns into erasure. That love cannot thrive where one person is always shrinking to keep the peace. The yacht's engine hummed softly. Glasses clinked behind her. Somewhere, someone laughed too loudly. Life continued. When Julian returned, he didn't interrupt her thoughts. He waited until she turned toward him. "If at any point you want to leave," he said evenly, "just say the word. No explanations needed." Her chest tightened, not with fear, but relief. "Thank you," she said, and meant more than the words. Later, as the evening deepened, Naomi moved through the space with ease she hadn't anticipated. She spoke to a few people she knew, distantly. She smiled when appropriate. She declined conversations she didn't want to have. Each small decision felt like practice, like muscle memory forming around a new way of being. No one cornered her. No one interrogated her. And when someone tried, Julian intercepted with quiet precision. Not possessive, not territorial, just respectful. She noticed how often he asked before assuming, how often he waited, how rarely he filled silence. It dawned on her then that attraction didn't have to feel like pursuit. It could feel like permission. As night settled fully, the yacht slowed again, lights reflecting off the water like scattered stars. Naomi stood near the rail once more, the cool air grounding her. Julian joined her, holding 2 glasses this time. He offered one without ceremony. "To calm evenings," he said. She accepted it. "And honest ones." They stood together in comfortable quiet, the past finally losing its grip, not because it had been defeated, but because it no longer defined her. Naomi understood something clearly in that moment. Walking away hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the first sentence, written in her own voice. If this story made you pause, if you've ever stayed quiet just to keep the peace, or walked away from something important without feeling the need to explain, then this story is for you. Take a moment to like this video so more people who need this message can find it. And tell me in the comments, have you ever chosen silence as a form of self-respect? If you believe love should never require you to disappear, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, because the chapters ahead will show what happens when dignity becomes the foundation, not the cost, of love. Chapter 2 is where we go back to where this pattern began, and why so many people learn to abandon themselves long before they ever fall in love. Naomi learned early that love came with instructions. They weren't written down. No one sat her at a table and explained them. They lived instead in small moments, glances, sighs, pauses long enough to teach her what not to say. She was 19 the first time she noticed it clearly. The kitchen was warm that evening, the air heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and something sweet baking in the oven. Her mother stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, shoulders tense in a way Naomi recognized even then. Her father sat at the table reading the paper, the soft rustle of pages filling the space where conversation might have lived. Naomi hovered in the doorway, watching. Her mother moved quickly, efficiently, as if the house itself would fall apart if she slowed down. When Naomi offered to help, her mother waved her off without looking up. "Go sit," she said. "You've had a long day." Naomi hesitated. "Don't mind." Her mother smiled. Then, tired but practiced, "I know you don't. That's why you're good." The word settled quietly in Naomi's chest. Good. At 19, being good felt like safety. It meant approval. It meant belonging. It meant not being a burden. Later that night, when her parents argued, softly, the way they always did, Naomi listened from her room. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just tension stretched thin. Words chosen carefully to avoid rupture. Her mother spoke in measured sentences about responsibilities and expectations. Her father responded with silence, punctuated by short phrases meant to end the conversation rather than resolve it. Eventually, Her mother sighed. The sound carried through the walls like a signal. "That's fine," she said. "We'll do it your way." The argument ended there. Naomi lay awake long after the house went quiet, staring at the ceiling, absorbing a lesson no one realized they were teaching her. Peace, she learned, was something you preserved by yielding. Her mother believed endurance was love. That commitment meant staying, even when staying cost you something unnamed. She wore her sacrifices like proof of devotion, rarely acknowledged, often expected. Her father believed silence was peace. That speaking too much only made things worse. He avoided conflict not out of cruelty, but fear. Fear of escalation, of breaking something he didn't know how to repair. Together, they modeled a marriage that survived by shrinking discomfort rather than addressing it. Naomi didn't judge them for it. She understood later that they had done the best they could with what they knew. But as a young woman, she internalized the message without question. Love required patience. Love required compromise. Love required silence. By the time she left home, those beliefs were already stitched into her sense of self. In college, Naomi excelled. Professors praised her reliability. Group projects went smoothly when she was involved because she never pushed too hard. She absorbed extra work without complaint, smoothed over disagreements, stayed late when others left early. "You're so easy to work with," people told her. She smiled every time. What no one noticed was how often she swallowed opinions that didn't align with the group, how often she deferred even when she had better ideas. It felt easier to be agreeable than to risk friction, easier to be useful than to be visible. Her first serious relationship followed the same pattern. He was kind, well-liked, admired for his ambition. Naomi admired him, too. She admired how confidently he spoke, how easily he took up space. When he decided things quickly, where they'd go, what they'd do, she told herself it was attractive. When he dismissed her concerns with a laugh, she told herself she was being too sensitive. Whenever tension arose, she resolved it the way she had learned to, by softening, by yielding, by staying quiet until the discomfort passed. The relationship ended not with a fight, but with exhaustion. One day, she realized she no longer recognized herself inside it. The grief that followed was quiet, heavy, confusing. People told her it was for the best, that she'd dodged a future problem. Naomi nodded, relieved. She hadn't had to explain why it hurt so much. By the time she entered the workforce, self-erasure had become second nature. She worked harder than most, stayed later than required, volunteered for projects no one wanted. Her supervisors trusted her implicitly. They gave her responsibility without authority, work without credit. "She doesn't complain," one manager said once, as if it were the highest compliment imaginable. Naomi accepted the praise, even as something inside her tightened. It wasn't that she didn't know how to speak up. It was that she didn't believe speaking up would be welcomed. Every environment she had moved through had reinforced the same quiet rule. Harmony mattered more than honesty. So she became fluent in adjustment. She adjusted her tone. She adjusted her expectations. She adjusted herself, and when Richard Carter entered her life years later, she was already primed to mistake certainty for care. He noticed her immediately, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. In rooms full of voices competing to be heard, Naomi listened. Richard liked that. He liked how calm she was, how composed, how rarely she challenged him. "You're different," he told her once, early on. "You don't need to control everything." She took it as a compliment. At that stage of her life, control felt exhausting. She wanted ease. She wanted stability. She wanted to believe that love didn't require so much effort. What she didn't yet understand was that ease without equality eventually becomes weight. Looking back now, Naomi could trace the pattern clearly. But patterns are difficult to see when you're standing inside them, when they've been normalized by years of reinforcement. No one had ever told her that love could be collaborative instead of sacrificial. No one had ever shown her that boundaries were not threats, but invitations to mutual respect. So she learned the hard way. And that lesson, slow, quiet, costly, began long before the marriage ever did. By the time Naomi understood she was disappearing, the habit was already comfortable. Comfortable didn't mean painless. It meant familiar. It meant she knew how to survive inside it. She learned quickly which parts of herself were welcome and which were not. Opinions were acceptable if they aligned with the group. Needs were acceptable if they were small. Discomfort was acceptable only if it could be resolved quietly. At work, this translated into reliability without recognition. Naomi was the one people called when something went wrong. She was the one who stayed late to fix mistakes that weren't hers. She became the solution to problems she hadn't created. And each time she stepped in without complaint, the expectation grew. When she finally asked for a raise after leading a major project, her manager looked genuinely surprised. "I didn't know you were unhappy," he said. She hadn't been unhappy exactly. She had been unseen. There was a difference, but it took her years to articulate it, even to herself. In meetings, she spoke last, if at all. She waited for cues. She framed her ideas as suggestions rather than statements. When someone interrupted her, she stopped talking, not because she lacked confidence, but because she had learned that interruption was a signal. Stop. Make room. Don't push. And when she did push, once or twice, experimentally, the response was subtle but clear. A raised eyebrow, a change in tone, a comment later about her being out of character. Out of character, she realized, meant inconvenient. Her friends admired her calm. They came to her for advice, for emotional labor, for reassurance. Naomi gave it freely, generously. She listened without judgment, absorbed other people's chaos, and rarely asked for the same in return. When she did ask, tentatively, she often found the space unavailable. People were busy. People were tired. People assumed she was fine. She was always fine. That assumption followed her into every relationship she formed. Partners leaned on her stability, her patience, her ability to smooth things over. When conflict arose, she was expected to de-escalate, to understand, to forgive quickly. "You're just better at handling things," one partner told her once, meaning it as praise. Naomi smiled, even as something in her chest tightened. Being better at handling things meant being responsible for them. It meant carrying weight that wasn't evenly distributed. She didn't know how to ask for more without feeling like she was asking for too much. The idea of making someone uncomfortable by expressing her needs filled her with unease. Discomfort felt dangerous, like it might cost her connection altogether. So she adjusted instead. She told herself she was adaptable, mature, emotionally intelligent. In reality, she was exhausted. When she met Richard, the contrast felt stark. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second guess. He didn't ask permission to take up space. He decided, and the world adjusted around him. For a woman who had spent her life adjusting herself, his certainty felt like rest. At first, it was. Richard liked that Naomi didn't challenge him publicly. He admired her composure, her ability to read rooms, her lack of visible ego. He often told people she was his anchor, his calm. Naomi took pride in that role. Anchors were important, weren't they? What she didn't realize was that anchors are meant to hold ships in place, not be dragged along behind them. As their relationship deepened, the pattern intensified. Decisions were made quickly, efficiently. Naomi's input was requested occasionally, acknowledged briefly, then absorbed into conclusions that had already been reached. When she hesitated, Richard reassured her. When pushed back, he softened his tone. When she withdrew, he praised her understanding. It was all very reasonable, very civilized, and deeply unbalanced. Naomi found herself preempting his reactions. She chose words carefully. She delayed difficult conversations until they no longer felt urgent. She convinced herself that her discomfort wasn't important enough to disrupt their life. After all, he wasn't cruel. He wasn't unfaithful. He wasn't loud, but love, she was learning too late, could still suffocate quietly. The moment of clarity didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with exhaustion. One evening, after another long day shaped by plans she hadn't agreed to, Naomi caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She looked composed, polished, distant. She tried to imagine explaining her life to a younger version of herself. The thought stopped her cold. She wouldn't know how to justify it. That was when she began paying attention, not to Richard's words, but to her own responses, to the way her chest tightened before certain conversations, to the relief she felt when she was alone, to the quiet dread that accompanied the phrase, "It's already decided." Leaving didn't feel brave. It felt necessary. And necessity, she learned, doesn't ask permission. Looking back, Naomi understood that no one moment had ruined her marriage. It had been built on years of learned silence, reinforced by praise, normalized by culture, and misunderstood as virtue. The education came late, but it came clearly. Self-respect is not loud, does not demand attention. It begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself. And once learned, it cannot be unlearned. When Naomi met Richard Carter, she wasn't looking for love. She told herself that often, and she believed it, at least on the surface. Her life was already full. Her career demanded focus. Her friendships filled most weekends. Romance, she believed, would arrive only if it fit neatly into the life she had already built. Richard didn't arrive quietly. He entered her world through proximity and presence. Introduced at a charity dinner she had almost declined attending. He stood out not because he was the loudest man in the room, but because people oriented themselves around him. Conversations adjusted when he joined them. Decisions shifted. Laughter followed. He noticed Naomi immediately, not in a dramatic way, not with a stare meant to unsettle her. He simply approached, extended his hand, and introduced himself with directness that felt rare. "You look like someone who's listening instead of waiting to speak," he said. It caught her off guard. Most people mistook her quiet for disinterest. Richard read it as intelligence. Their conversation flowed easily. He asked questions. She answered thoughtfully. He spoke confidently. She admired the certainty in his voice. When he suggested dinner later that week, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt decided. She told herself that was refreshing. Richard's life was expansive. He moved through it with authority and ease. He talked about business the way some people talked about weather, casually, confidently, as if outcomes bent naturally in his favor. Naomi listened, intrigued, drawn to the steadiness he projected. When she spoke about her work, he listened too, but differently, with approval rather than curiosity. He admired what she did, but more than that, he admired how little she demanded credit for it. "You don't need to prove yourself," he told her once, early on. "You already know who you are." The words settled warmly in her chest. She didn't realize then how badly she wanted to be seen as complete without having to assert herself. Their relationship progressed quickly, but not recklessly. Richard was efficient, even in romance. He made plans in advance. He chose restaurants, trips, timelines. Naomi found herself relieved by the structure. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel responsible for steering the relationship. She let herself be carried. Friends commented on how well they fit, how calm she seemed, how grounded he was. Naomi nodded, accepting the praise without examining it too closely. Being chosen felt good. Being admired felt safe. When Richard proposed, it happened on a balcony, overlooking a city she loved. There were no grand theatrics, no audience, just a ring, a clear plan, and a confident smile. "I don't waste time on things I'm unsure about," he said. "I want you." Naomi said yes, without hesitation. Marriage, she believed, was about partnership, about building something stable, about choosing commitment over constant evaluation. She entered it with sincerity, with hope, with the same willingness to adapt that had guided her through every other phase of her life. At first, the marriage felt exactly as promised. The house was beautiful. The routines were smooth. Richard handled logistics effortlessly. Naomi supported him, hosted with grace, maintained her own work alongside his demanding schedule. They moved as a unit in public, admired for their polish. When compromises arose, Naomi made them instinctively. When Richard's meetings ran late, she adjusted dinner. When travel plans changed suddenly, she reorganized her calendar. When her work conflicted with his obligations, she found a way to reschedule. She told herself this was marriage. After all, no one was forcing her. She was choosing to be flexible, choosing harmony, choosing love. What she didn't notice, at first, was how rarely the choice went the other way. Richard never asked her to give anything up directly. He simply moved forward, as if her availability were assumed. His life operated on momentum, and Naomi learned to orbit around it. When she did voice a preference, tentatively, it was acknowledged, then weighed against practicality. "This just makes more sense," Richard would say, already adjusting the plan. Naomi nodded. It usually did make sense, at least on paper. And paper had always been convincing. Their conversations stayed polite. Civil, efficient disagreements were rare, mostly because Naomi avoided them before they fully formed. She had become skilled at identifying moments where pushing back might create tension and stepping aside instead. Richard appreciated that. "You're not like other women," he told her once, smiling. "You understand how things work." She smiled back, unsure why the compliment left her feeling strangely hollow. Slowly, subtly, the marriage took on a shape she hadn't consciously agreed to. Her role became supportive rather than collaborative. Her presence became expected rather than engaged. Her silence became interpreted as agreement. At dinners, Richard spoke for them both. Naomi laughed when appropriate, nodded when introductions were made, offered polite insights when invited. People admired her composure. "She's so grounded," they said. Naomi wondered when grounded had begun to feel like rooted in place. There were moments, small, fleeting, when she felt the imbalance. When a decision was announced instead of discussed. When her schedule was rearranged without consultation. When her work was treated as flexible by default. Each time, she brushed the discomfort aside. "This, what partnership looks like," she told herself. This is what stability requires. This is what being mature means. It wasn't until much later that she would realize how carefully she had been taught to confuse adaptation with love. At the time, she simply believed she had chosen well, and perhaps she had, based on who she was then. The first thing Naomi lost was time. Not all at once, not in a way that felt alarming. It happened in increments so small they passed for normal adjustment. A meeting rescheduled here, a dinner canceled there, a weekend rearranged because something came up. Richard's life ran on urgency. Everything was important. Everything was time-sensitive. Everything required immediate attention. Naomi adapted because adaptation had always been her strength. At first, she told herself it was temporary, that once things settled, once a deal closed or a project finished, balance would return. Balance, she learned, was always just one milestone away. Her own work didn't disappear. It simply became secondary. Flexible, optional, in ways Richard's never was. When conflicts arose, the assumption was unspoken, but firm. Hers would move. "You can do that any time," Richard would say casually. "This is fixed." Naomi nodded. It usually was. What unsettled her wasn't that Richard didn't care. It was that he didn't notice. He moved through life with the confidence of someone accustomed to accommodation. The world had adjusted around him for so long that it felt natural to expect it. Naomi became part of that adjustment. At social gatherings, she was introduced as supportive, understanding, adaptable. People admired her ability to handle Richard's demanding lifestyle. They praised her for never making things complicated. She smiled through it, even as the praise began to feel like a script she hadn't written. There were moments, quiet, private ones, when she considered pushing back, when she rehearsed sentences in her head. "I need more notice. I want to be consulted. This matters to me." The words never quite made it to her mouth. She worried about sounding ungrateful, about disrupting a life that looked enviable from the outside, about being labeled difficult after spending so long being admired for the opposite. Instead, she made peace with small losses. She stopped scheduling things too far in advance. She kept her calendar flexible, just in case. She learned to anticipate Richard's needs before he voiced them. It felt efficient. It felt considerate. It felt like love. Over time, the house grew quieter in ways she couldn't name. Conversations became logistical. Evenings passed side by side, connected but distant. Richard was rarely unkind, but he was often absent, physically present, mentally elsewhere. Naomi filled the space by staying useful. She hosted dinners flawlessly. She remembered names. She managed details no one else noticed. She made life smoother. And smoothness, she realized, was rewarded. When she did express frustration, softly, carefully, it was often met with reassurance instead of change. "You're overthinking," Richard would say, not unkindly. "We're doing great." Great, Naomi learned, could exist alongside loneliness. The first time she noticed the weight of it was late one night, lying awake beside him. The room was dark, the house silent. Richard slept easily, one arm draped across the space between them without quite touching her. Naomi stared at the ceiling, counting breaths. She tried to remember the last time she'd felt fully heard. Not listened to politely. Heard. The thought unsettled her enough that she rolled onto her side, facing away, and forced herself to sleep. In the mornings, she was fine again. Composed, capable, reliable. This, too, was part of the pattern. Discomfort arrived at night, when the world stopped demanding her attention, and she could no longer distract herself from her own thoughts. By morning, she had learned to tuck it away. Richard trusted her. He relied on her steadiness. He rarely questioned her loyalty. From his perspective, the marriage worked. From Naomi's, it endured. The distinction mattered more than she had the courage to admit. The moment she finally spoke, really spoke, came not from anger, but fatigue. It was an ordinary evening. No argument, no build-up, just another decision, announced in passing. Something that would reshape her schedule for months. She listened, nodded once, then surprised herself by asking a simple question. "Did you consider asking me first?" Richard looked at her, genuinely puzzled. "Why would I?" he said, then smiled, realizing how it sounded. "I mean, this is what makes sense. Trust me. I know what I'm doing." The words landed softly and landed completely. Naomi felt something settle inside her. Not hurt, not rage, but understanding. The kind that doesn't ask for debate. He wasn't trying to diminish her. He simply didn't see her as someone whose consent was required. In that moment, Naomi recognized a truth she could no longer ignore. Love that required her silence was not love that could sustain her. She didn't argue. She didn't escalate. She didn't demand an apology. She went quiet, not in surrender, but in clarity. From that point on, everything she did was deliberate. She paid attention to her own reactions, to the tension she'd normalized, to the relief she felt when Richard traveled alone, to the way her body relaxed when she imagined a life not shaped by constant adjustment. Leaving didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. And inevitability, she would learn, is the calmest form of resolve. From the outside, Naomi's life looked finished, polished, complete, enviable. The house sat on a quiet street, lined with old trees and discreet security. The rooms were spacious, filled with light that poured in through floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything had its place. Nothing felt accidental. People admired it openly. They admired the address, the art on the walls. The dinners Naomi hosted with effortless grace. They admired Richard's success and Naomi's composure, the way she seemed to glide through it all without strain. "She's so lucky," someone said once, standing in the kitchen with a glass of wine. "Most women would kill for this." Naomi smiled, because smiling had become reflex. Luck, she had learned, was a complicated word. The house was never loud. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices echoing through the halls. There was only the constant hum of motion, staff coming and going, schedules syncing and shifting, Richard's phone vibrating at all hours. Naomi adapted by becoming quieter. She learned how to occupy space without disrupting it, how to move through rooms without being noticed, how to keep conversations light and agreeable. When Richard came home late, she adjusted dinner. When plans changed suddenly, she rearranged her day. The house ran smoothly because she ran it smoothly. Her own work continued, but it lived on the margins of Richard's life. Meetings were rescheduled, deadlines negotiated, projects stretched thin by availability that wasn't always hers to control. When she mentioned the strain, Richard reassured her. "This is temporary," he said. "Once things slow down, you'll have more freedom." Things never slowed down. At social events, Naomi became a kind of anchor, steady, calming, endlessly accommodating. People gravitated toward her when conversations grew tense. She smoothed interactions, deflected awkwardness, made everyone feel comfortable. Richard watched her do this with appreciation. "You're incredible at this," he told her once, after a particularly demanding evening. "You make everything easier." Easier. The word followed her long after the guests had gone. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering when ease had become the measure of her worth. The loneliness didn't announce itself. It crept in quietly, disguised as routine. Mornings passed in parallel. Evenings blurred together. Conversations became transactional. Updates exchanged. Schedules reviewed. Logistics confirmed. Intimacy became another item to manage, something penciled in when energy allowed. Naomi missed being asked questions that didn't have practical answers. "How are you really? What do you need? What do you want today?" She couldn't remember the last time Richard had asked any of them. When she brought it up, carefully, he listened with concern. "I had no idea you felt that way," he said sincerely. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" The question landed heavier than he realized. She hadn't said something sooner because she didn't know how, because she had learned that expressing need came with consequences, because every environment she had been shaped by rewarded endurance over honesty. She tried to explain, but words felt clumsy, inadequate. She watched Richard's attention drift, not out of cruelty, but unfamiliarity. Emotional nuance was not his native language. He offered solutions instead of presence. Take a vacation, he suggested. Hire more help. We'll fix it. Fixing wasn't what she needed. She needed to be seen. The longer she stayed, the more invisible she felt. Not erased, exactly, acknowledged in public, praised in private, but unseen in the places that mattered. The house remained beautiful. The life remained impressive. Naomi felt smaller inside it. She began to notice how often she chose silence to preserve peace. How often she edited herself before speaking. How often she anticipated Richard's reactions and adjusted accordingly. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of disrupting the life they had built. And that fear, she realized slowly, had become its own kind of prison. One afternoon, standing alone in the living room surrounded by glass and light, Naomi caught her reflection in a mirror she rarely used. She looked composed, put together, successful. She also looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. It startled her how little of herself she recognized. The golden cage didn't lock itself. She had walked into it willingly, believing safety and stability were worth the cost. Now she stood inside it, wondering when comfort had stopped feeling kind. She understood then that luxury could soften suffering without removing it. That money could insulate pain without addressing it. That silence could keep everything intact while slowly erasing the person living inside it. The realization didn't break her. It steadied her, because once you see the cage for what it is, you begin to imagine the door. Naomi didn't realize how dangerous praise could be until it started replacing conversation. "You're so easy," Richard told her one evening, smiling as he loosened his tie. "I don't know how I got so lucky." She smiled back because the words were meant kindly, because they sounded like appreciation, because she had been trained her entire life to receive compliments without questioning the cost attached to them. Easy meant she didn't argue. Easy meant she didn't ask for more. Easy meant she adapted without resistance. At first, being easy felt like love. Over time, it felt like expectation. Whenever friends gathered, Naomi played her role effortlessly. She remembered everyone's preferences, smoothed over awkward moments, anticipated needs before they were voiced. People gravitated toward her warmth. They confided in her, leaned on her, praised her composure. "You're so low maintenance," one woman said admiringly. "I could never." Naomi laughed politely, unaware that low maintenance had quietly become synonymous with low need. In private, she began to feel the strain of carrying so much emotional weight without acknowledgement. Not because Richard was unkind, but because he was accustomed to her availability, to her steadiness, to her silence. When Naomi tried to express fatigue, she framed it carefully. "I think I'm just a bit overwhelmed," she said once, choosing her words like stepping stones. Richard looked genuinely concerned. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" She didn't know how to explain that she had been saying something all along, just not out loud. The truth was, she had learned to speak in hints and hope someone would notice. She had learned to soften every request so it wouldn't sound like demand. She had learned to apologize for needing rest. Richard responded the way he always did, with solutions. Let's get more help. Take a break. Don't stress so much. Each suggestion was reasonable. Each missed the point. She didn't want fixes. She wanted presence. She wanted to feel like her internal world mattered as much as the external one they curated together. Instead, the gap between them widened quietly. Naomi began to retreat inward, conserving energy. She stopped bringing up topics that led nowhere. She chose her battles by avoiding them altogether. The house remained peaceful, immaculate, functional, lonely. At night she lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of Richard's breathing, wondering how two people could share a bed and feel so separate. She catalogued her days the way you inventory a life, checking for joy, for meaning, for self. The results unsettled her. She still loved Richard, or at least she loved the version of them she had believed in. Love didn't vanish overnight. It thinned. It stretched. It became something she carried alone. And carrying it alone was exhausting. One evening, after a particularly long day shaped by obligations she hadn't chosen, Naomi stood in the bathroom brushing her hair, watching her reflection move automatically through familiar motions. The woman staring back at her looked composed, capable, controlled. She looked like someone who had learned to survive very well. What she didn't look like was someone who felt alive. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with sadness, deep, steady, unmistakable. The kind of sadness that doesn't ask to be comforted. It asks to be respected. Naomi set the brush down and sat on the edge of the tub, hands folded loosely in her lap. This is not what love is supposed to feel like, she thought. The thought didn't accuse Richard. It didn't assign blame. It simply stated a truth she could no longer ignore. Love should not require constant self-editing. Love should not reward silence over honesty. Love should not make you feel smaller to keep it intact. That night, she didn't say anything to Richard, not because she was afraid, but because she understood something new. Clarity doesn't always need an audience. In the days that followed, she paid closer attention, not to what Richard did wrong, but to what she felt right. The relief she experienced when alone. The tension she felt before certain conversations. The ease that returned when expectations were removed. She realized she had been living in anticipation rather than presence. Always preparing. Always adjusting. The golden cage hadn't been built by force. It had been built by praise, by comfort, by the promise that stability was worth any quiet cost. Once Naomi named that truth, the cage lost its power. Leaving didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like alignment, and alignment, she would soon learn, does not announce itself loudly. It simply moves, calm, deliberate, irreversible. The moment that ended Naomi's marriage didn't look like an ending. It arrived on an ordinary evening, disguised as efficiency. Richard was standing in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone with the ease of someone used to making decisions quickly. Naomi sat at the table across from him, a folder open in front of her. Notes from a meeting she had rushed through to be home on time. "I moved our travel plans," Richard said casually, not looking up. "We'll be gone most of next month." Naomi paused, pen hovering above the page. "Next month?" she asked. "Yes, it makes more sense with the schedule." She waited, expecting more. An explanation, a question, something that acknowledged her. "Did something change?" she asked carefully. "No," he said. "I just finalized it." Her chest tightened, not sharply, but enough to be noticeable. She thought of her commitments, the projects she had agreed to lead, the people who depended on her availability. "I wasn't aware we were discussing it," she said, still calm. Richard looked up then, mildly surprised, as if the thought hadn't occurred to him. "It's already handled," he said. "I assumed you'd be fine with it." The word assumed lingered between them. Naomi studied his face, searching for irritation, defensiveness, anything that suggested he understood the weight of what he'd said. She found none, only certainty. She tried again, choosing honesty over habit. "I would have liked to be part of that decision," she said. The sentence was simple, measured, reasonable. Richard laughed softly, not mockingly, fondly. "Trust me," he said. "Know what I'm doing." Something inside Naomi went still. Not numb, not angry. Clear. She had heard those words before, in different forms, from different people. They had always meant the same thing. Your voice is not required here. In that moment, Naomi understood that this wasn't about travel plans, or schedules, or miscommunication. It was about how they existed inside the marriage. Richard believed leadership meant deciding. Naomi had been taught love meant adapting. Neither belief was malicious, but together they were incompatible. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't push further. She didn't argue the logistics. Instead, she nodded once. "Okay," she said. Richard smiled, satisfied, already returning his attention to his phone. The conversation ended, but something else had begun. Later that night, Naomi lay awake beside him, the room dark and quiet. Richard's breathing was steady, untroubled. Naomi stared at the ceiling, her thoughts unspooling with an unfamiliar calm. She replayed the conversation, not with regret, but with curiosity. She examined her reaction, the absence of panic, the lack of urgency to fix anything. For the first time, she wasn't trying to make the discomfort disappear. She let it exist. And in that space, clarity took shape. She realized she had been negotiating her presence for years, asking to be included instead of assuming inclusion. explaining her needs instead of expecting them to matter. She realized she had confused love with accommodation. The realization didn't accuse Richard, didn't vilify him. It simply acknowledged a truth she could no longer avoid. Staying would require continued self-erasure, and leaving would not. The next morning, she moved through her routine as usual. Coffee, emails, a quick scan of her calendar. Everything looked the same, but sounded different. She felt resolved. Naomi didn't announce her decision. She didn't seek validation. She didn't test the waters by hinting. She scheduled a meeting with a lawyer. She went alone. The office was quiet, professional, neutral. The lawyer asked questions gently, offering options, outlining processes. Naomi listened carefully, asked what she needed to know, and declined what she didn't. When the lawyer asked if she wanted time to think, Naomi shook her head. "I'm clear," she said. Clarity, she had learned, didn't require urgency. In the days that followed, she paid attention to herself, to the absence of dread, to the lightness in her chest, to the way her body responded to the decision with relief rather than fear. She hadn't stopped loving Richard. She had stopped abandoning herself. When the papers were ready, she signed them without spectacle, without confrontation, without a speech, prepared to justify her choice. The attorney had looked surprised. The assistant had paused, pen mid-air. Naomi didn't explain. She stood, smoothed her skirt, nodded once, and walked out. The hallway felt cooler than she expected, the air lighter, her steps quieter. Didn't cry. She didn't look back, because the decision hadn't been made in that office. It had been made the moment she realized that love without respect was not love she could live inside. Naomi expected questions. What she didn't expect was how quickly people demanded answers, as if they were owed. The silence after she signed the papers was brief. Too brief. Word traveled fast, reshaped by speculation before truth could keep up. By the end of the week, messages began to arrive. Some careful, some clumsy, some thinly disguised as concern. "Are you okay? What happened? Did something terrible occur?" Naomi read a few. She ignored most, not out of spite, but preservation. She had learned that explanations often invite negotiations, and she was no longer negotiating her decision. Richard reacted the way she expected. Calm at first, confused later. He asked for a conversation. She agreed, choosing civility over avoidance. They met in the living room they had shared for years, sitting across from each other like acquaintances. "I don't understand," he said honestly. "You never said you were this unhappy." Naomi nodded. "I know." It wasn't an accusation. It was an acknowledgement. "You have talked to me," he continued. "We could have fixed things, She considered her response carefully. "I talked," she said. "I just didn't argue." Richard frowned slightly, as if parsing something unfamiliar. "I didn't realize it was that serious." "That's part of the problem," she replied gently. He fell silent. Naomi felt no urge to convince him. She wasn't trying to win an argument. She wasn't seeking closure from him. She had already given it to herself. The conversation ended politely, without resolution, without raised voices. Richard walked away confused. Naomi walked away free. The public reaction was louder. Friends chose sides without realizing there were sides to choose. Some framed her as impulsive. Others framed her as ungrateful. A few framed her as brave, though that word made her uncomfortable. She didn't feel brave. She felt aligned. At first, the quiet unsettled her. She had spent so long adjusting to other people's expectations that standing alone felt exposed. There were evenings when doubt crept in, whispering familiar questions. Was I too rigid? Should I have tried harder? Did I give up too easily? Each time, she returned to the same answer. Staying would have required her to disappear. That was not an option anymore. Naomi returned fully to her work, this time on her own terms. She restructured her schedule, declined projects that demanded too much, accepted opportunities that aligned with her values instead of her image. The discomfort didn't vanish overnight. Saying no still felt unnatural at times. She had to remind herself that boundaries were not punishments. They were instructions. The more she practiced, the easier it became. She noticed how people responded when she stopped over-explaining. Some pushed back, others adjusted. A few drifted away. She let them. One afternoon, while reviewing logistics for a nonprofit partnership, she met Julian Hayes. The meeting was brief, professional, unremarkable in every way that mattered. Julian arrived on time. He listened without interrupting. When Naomi outlined her availability, he nodded and adjusted the plan without comment. "No problem," he said. "We'll work around that." The simplicity of it caught her off guard. There was no subtle resistance, no probing, no attempt to negotiate her boundary into something more convenient. They finished the meeting efficiently. When it ended, Julian stood. "Thank you for being clear," he said. "It makes collaboration easier." Clear? Naomi hadn't been called that before. They worked together for several weeks. Conversations stayed focused, respectful. When disagreements arose, Julian addressed them directly, without dominance. When Naomi declined an invitation to dinner after a late meeting, he accepted the answer without pushing. "Another time," he said, meaning it. The absence of pressure felt almost unfamiliar. Naomi didn't romanticize it. She didn't assign meaning where none existed. She simply noticed how calm she felt in his presence. Calm, she was learning, was not boredom. It was safety. When Julian eventually invited her to join a small gathering on his yacht, she hesitated, not because of him, but because she was still learning to trust ease. He didn't follow up. He didn't persuade. He didn't frame the invitation as a test. When she accepted days later, he thanked her and left it at that. Now, standing on the deck as the yacht moved steadily forward, Naomi understood the weight of the moment, not because it shocked anyone else, but because it affirmed something within her. She hadn't left one life to perform in another. She had left to stand whole. And for the first time, love, or the possibility of it, did not ask her to choose between connection and self-respect. It simply waited. If you've ever realized the truth after the moment passed, if you've ever noticed that the calm you feel after leaving says more than the chaos you felt while staying, then this chapter was for you. Take a second to like this video, so this message reaches someone who might be questioning a quiet decision they haven't explained yet. And tell me in the comments, have you ever reached a point where clarity replaced emotion, and you knew there was no going back? If stories about self-respect, boundaries, and emotionally mature love matter to you, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. Because what comes next isn't about starting over loudly. It's about rebuilding slowly, honestly, and without apology. Chapter 6 begins the part most people don't talk about: what life looks like after you walk away. Life after leaving did not unfold like freedom. It unfolded like space. Too much of it at first. Naomi hadn't anticipated how loud silence could be when no one else was filling it. The days after the divorce settled into her life without ceremony. No dramatic collapse, no immediate relief. Just mornings that arrived without shared routines, and evenings that stretched longer than she expected. She woke up early out of habit, reached for her phone instinctively, then stopped. There was no one to check in with, no schedule to align herself around, no decisions already made for her. The absence felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. For years, her sense of direction had been tied to someone else's momentum. Without it, she had to relearn how to listen to herself. That process was slower than she liked. She discovered how often she asked herself what she should do instead of what she wanted to do. How reflexively she justified rest. How uncomfortable she felt making plans that didn't involve accommodating someone else's needs. Healing, she learned, was not a straight line. It was a series of small, quiet confrontations with habits she had mistaken for personality. At work, Naomi restructured her calendar. She declined roles that demanded constant flexibility without reciprocity. She proposed timelines instead of absorbing them. The first few times she did it, her voice wavered. No one reacted the way she feared. Some people adjusted, some resisted briefly, a few lost interest. Each response taught her something important. The right people didn't require self-erasure to stay. Outside of work, friendships shifted. Without the marriage to anchor her identity, conversations changed. Some friends leaned in, curious, and supportive. Others drifted, unsure how to place her now that she no longer fit the narrative they'd grown comfortable with. Naomi let the changes happen. She had learned that forcing closeness was another form of self-abandonment. Loneliness came in waves, not sharp, but heavy. There were evenings when she missed familiarity more than connection, when she questioned whether choosing herself had been worth the quiet that followed. During those moments, she reminded herself of a truth she had earned the hard way. Comfort is not the same as belonging. Belonging, she was learning, begins with self-trust. She began taking long walks without destination. She sat in cafes alone without distraction. She paid attention to what brought her ease and what drained her energy. Slowly, patterns emerged. She slept better. She breathed deeper. She felt present in her own body again. That presence changed how she moved through the world. People responded differently to her now, not dramatically, but subtly. Conversations felt more balanced. Requests came with respect. Silence no longer felt like something she needed to fill. When Naomi met Julian Hayes again, this time during a follow-up meeting, she noticed how different the interaction felt from relationships she had known before. Julian didn't rush. He didn't dominate the conversation. He asked clarifying questions and waited for her answers without interrupting. When she set parameters around her availability, he adjusted the project timeline without comment. "Let me know if this still works for you," he said. "We can revisit if needed." There was no implication that her boundaries were temporary inconveniences. The steadiness of it startled her. Over the weeks that followed, they worked closely, but never intrusively. Julian respected transitions. He checked in without hovering. When Naomi expressed disagreement, he listened without defensiveness. Attraction, when it appeared, did so quietly, not as urgency, not as pursuit, but as recognition. Naomi noticed how relaxed she felt around him, how little she felt the urge to perform, how easy it was to speak plainly without cushioning her words. One evening, after a long planning session, Julian offered to walk her to her car. They talked about nothing important: traffic, weather, an upcoming deadline. When they reached her car, he paused. "I enjoy working with you," he said. "If you ever feel like continuing the conversation outside of meetings, I'd like that." There was no expectation attached to the sentence, no pressure hidden beneath it. Naomi didn't answer immediately. He noticed and smiled lightly. No rush. That, more than the invitation itself, stayed with her. For the first time, the possibility of connection didn't feel like a decision she needed to rush into. It felt like something she could approach with the same care she had learned to give herself. Later that night, Naomi sat by her window, city lights flickering below. She thought about how much had changed, not externally, but internally. She had stopped measuring her worth by how much she could endure. She had stopped equating love with accommodation. She had stopped mistaking silence for peace. Life after walking away was not easy, but it was honest. And honesty, she was discovering, was the most supportive foundation she had ever stood on. Confidence did not arrive all at once. It arrived in small, almost unremarkable moments. Moments Naomi might once have dismissed as insignificant. Like the afternoon she declined a meeting without offering an apology, or the morning she rescheduled a call because she needed rest and didn't justify it with exhaustion or urgency, or the evening she left a gathering early simply because she felt done. Each decision felt slightly uncomfortable at first, like wearing shoes that fit properly after years of squeezing into smaller ones. She noticed how often people mirrored her tone. When she spoke clearly, they listened clearly. When she paused instead of filling silence, others adjusted. Boundaries, she realized, were contagious. Not everyone responded well. A few colleagues bristled at her newfound firmness. A friend accused her, half joking, half serious, of being distant. Naomi listened without retreating. Distance, she understood now, was not always a loss. Sometimes it was a correction. The more she trusted herself, the less she needed external validation. Praise still felt good, but it no longer defined her direction. Disapproval no longer felt catastrophic. She was learning how to stay with herself, even when others were uncomfortable. That skill changed everything. Her interactions with Julian continued in the same steady rhythm, professional, respectful, quietly warm. When they disagreed, it didn't escalate. When she set a boundary, he accepted it. When he needed something clarified, he asked directly. There was no guessing, no mind reading, no emotional labor disguised as romance. One afternoon, after a planning session ran long, Julian leaned back in his chair and said, "We've covered a lot. Do you want to pause here or keep going?" The question caught her attention, not because it was unusual, but because it wasn't. She was used to momentum dictating pace, used to adjusting herself to match someone else's urgency. Being asked felt grounding. "Let's pause," she said. He nodded. "Sounds good." Later, as they walked out together, Julian glanced at her. "You're very clear about what works for you," he said. "It makes collaboration easier." Naomi smiled. That hasn't always been true. He didn't pry. He didn't ask for the story. He let the comment stand as it was. That restraint mattered more than curiosity. When they eventually did go to dinner, it felt nothing like the beginnings she remembered from her past. There was no rush to impress, no subtle performance. They spoke about their work, their values, the ways they approached decision-making. Julian talked openly about his own habits, his tendency to move quickly, his respect for people who named limits early. "I used to think boundaries slowed things down," he said. "Now I see they prevent misunderstandings." Naomi considered the truth in that. She noticed how relaxed her shoulders felt, how present she was in the conversation, how little she was monitoring herself. Attraction, she realized, didn't have to feel destabilizing. It could feel like steadiness. There were moments when old reflexes surfaced, times when Naomi felt the urge to soften a request or downplay a need. When that happened, she paused. She named the discomfort instead of yielding to it. Julian noticed. "You don't have to make it easier for me," he said once, gently. "I can handle clarity." The words landed deeply. She had spent years making things easier for others at her own expense. Hearing someone say they didn't need that from her felt like permission she hadn't known she was waiting for. Trust built slowly, deliberately. They didn't rush labels. They didn't fill silence with assumptions. They allowed space for uncertainty without treating it as a problem to solve. One evening, Naomi returned home after dinner and stood in her living room, the quiet no longer oppressive but welcoming. She thought about how different this felt from the silence she had once endured. This silence didn't erase her. It held her. She understood then that rebuilding wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about returning to herself, the self she had edited, softened, postponed. Self-respect, she learned, was not rigid or cold. It was attentive, responsive, kind, and when shared, it became the strongest foundation for connection she had ever known. Naomi didn't fall in love the way she used to. There was no rush of urgency, no sense of being swept up, no fear of losing momentum if she didn't lean in quickly enough. What she felt instead was steady awareness. Julian entered her life the way some truths do, quietly, persistently, without demanding attention. Their connection grew through repetition rather than intensity, through consistency rather than surprise. They spent time together without agenda, sometimes over dinner, sometimes walking through neighborhoods Naomi hadn't explored before, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence, each reading or working while sharing the same space. Julian never mistook proximity for entitlement. He didn't assume availability. He didn't interpret pauses as rejection. He allowed room for Naomi to show up fully, at her own pace. That freedom was intoxicating in its own way. Naomi noticed how often she checked in with herself now, how she asked internal questions before responding. Do I want this? Does this feel aligned? Am I choosing or defaulting? The answers came more easily than she expected. When Julian reached for her hand for the first time, it wasn't in public or under pressure. They were walking along the river at dusk, the air cool and calm. He slowed his pace slightly, glanced at her, and extended his hand. Open, patient. She took it without hesitation. The gesture felt symbolic, though neither of them named it. An invitation offered, an invitation accepted. There were moments when Naomi felt old fears stir, the worry that if she didn't accommodate enough, the connection might fade. That if she asserted herself too firmly, she might be seen as difficult. Each time, reality contradicted the fear. When Julian accepted it. When she needed space, he respected it. When she voiced concern, he listened without defensiveness. Attraction deepened because of it, not despite it. Julian, too, adjusted. He noticed his own tendencies to move quickly, to plan ahead. When Naomi expressed the need to stay present rather than future-focused, he slowed. I don't want to rush something that deserves care, he said. That sentence stayed with her. Love, she realized, didn't need to be proven through speed. Their first real conflict arrived unexpectedly, not as a rupture, but a test. Julian proposed a joint trip, tied loosely to work and leisure. He framed it casually, already outlining logistics. Naomi felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Old patterns stirred. She paused, took a breath, and spoke before the reflex to soften could take over. I need to slow this down, she said. Not because I don't want to go, but because I want to be intentional. Julian listened, really listened. Thank you for telling me, he said. What would feel better for you? The question reshaped the moment. They talked openly about timing, expectations, and the fear of repeating old dynamics. Julian shared his own habits, his desire to move forward when something felt right. Naomi shared her need for steadiness over momentum. Neither dismissed the other. They adjusted together. The conflict didn't weaken the connection. It strengthened it. Naomi understood then that love didn't have to challenge boundaries to feel real. It could honor them and still grow. What she felt with Julian wasn't the intoxicating unpredictability she once mistook for passion. It was something steadier, something that didn't require vigilance. She could rest inside it. One evening, after a quiet dinner at home, Naomi realized something else had changed. She wasn't wondering who she needed to become to be loved. She was wondering who she already was, and how that person felt choosing connection. The answer surprised her. She felt grounded, present, enough. Love, she was learning, didn't ask her to perform. It asked her to stay. Intimacy, Naomi discovered, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the absence of tension. She noticed it in the way Julian listened when she spoke, without waiting for a pause he could fill. In the way he remembered small details, without turning them into leverage. In the way he didn't rush to define what they were becoming, as if certainty required a label to be real. Their closeness grew in layers. They shared stories gradually, not as confessions, but as context. Julian spoke about his childhood, the early pressure to succeed, the habits he'd developed to stay in control of outcomes. Naomi listened, recognizing the echoes of her own history in his. Not the same story, but similar instincts shaped by different lessons. When she shared parts of her marriage, she did so without bitterness, without rehearsed conclusions. Julian didn't interrupt. He didn't offer judgment or validation where it wasn't asked for. That must have taken a lot of strength, he said once, simply. Naomi shook her head slightly. It took honesty. Strength came later. He smiled at that, not as praise, but understanding. They learned each other's rhythms. Julian worked best early in the morning. Naomi preferred long afternoons where focus came naturally. Instead of forcing alignment, they respected difference. Some nights they were together, though other nights they weren't. Neither absence felt like a test. That alone told Naomi how far she had come. In past relationships, distance had always felt like danger, like something she needed to fix quickly before it became permanent. Now, space felt neutral, sometimes even restorative. One evening, after spending a long day together, Julian stood at her door and hesitated. "I like being with you," he said, "but I don't want to assume anything. I want us to move at a pace that feels right for both of us." Naomi met his gaze. She felt no pressure to reassure him, no fear of losing momentum. "I feel the same," she said. They smiled, softly, easily, and said goodnight. As she closed the door, Naomi leaned against it, surprised by the warmth in her chest. Not excitement, not relief, trust. That trust made room for honesty when it mattered most. A few weeks later, during a conversation about future possibilities, nothing concrete, just curiosity, Naomi felt a familiar tug. Julian spoke thoughtfully about what he wanted long-term. Stability, partnership, a life built intentionally. She listened, nodding, until she realized something important. She was agreeing too quickly. The old reflex flickered. She paused, placed her glass down, and chose a different response. "I need to say something," she said calmly. "Not to disagree, but to be clear." Julian turned toward her, attentive. "I'm still learning what I want next," she continued. "I don't want to promise alignment before I'm sure. That doesn't mean I don't care. It means I respect where I am." The words landed gently, but firmly. Julian considered them without interruption. "I appreciate that," he said finally. "I don't need certainty right now. I need honesty." Naomi exhaled, a weight lifting she hadn't realized she was carrying. She had spoken her truth without cushioning it, and it hadn't cost her connection. That moment stayed with her because it proved something essential. The right relationship doesn't punish clarity. It deepens it. Over time, Naomi felt herself relaxing into the relationship, not because she was letting her guard down, but because she no longer needed one. There was nothing to defend, nothing to manage. She didn't feel responsible for Julian's emotions. He didn't feel entitled to hers. They showed up as whole people, choosing each other rather than completing each other. One afternoon, as they walked through a quiet park, Julian stopped and looked at her. "You don't disappear when things get real," he said. "I notice that." Naomi smiled. I'm glad you don't anymore." So was she. Love, Naomi realized, wasn't about losing yourself in another person. It was about being fully yourself with them and being welcomed there. And that kind of love didn't rush. It stayed. The invitation arrived without drama. Julian mentioned it casually one evening as they cleared plates from dinner. "A small gathering," he said. "A few friends. Some colleagues. Nothing formal. It's on the yacht," he added, almost as an afterthought. "If you'd rather not, that's completely fine." Naomi paused, dishcloth in her hands. The word yacht carried weight she hadn't asked for. It summoned images she hadn't visited in a while. Luxury as spectacle, wealth as performance, spaces where appearances mattered more than truth. She didn't answer right away. Julian noticed and said nothing. He didn't fill the silence with reassurance or persuasion. He simply continued rinsing a plate, giving her room to feel what she needed to feel. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Of course," he replied. "Take your time." That night, Naomi lay awake longer than usual, not because of fear, but memory. She thought of the last yacht she had stepped onto, the way she had learned to smile at the right moments, to hold conversations lightly, to perform ease even when it cost her. She wasn't that anymore. But stepping into a public space, tied to her past, would test that truth. Over the next few days, she noticed her thoughts circling the invitation, not with anxiety, but curiosity. What would it feel like to show up as herself now? To enter a room without preparing defenses or rehearsing explanations? She realized something quietly important. She wasn't afraid of being seen. She was afraid of being misunderstood and choosing not to correct it. That realization told her everything she needed to know. She accepted the invitation 2 days later. Julian's response was simple. "I'm glad," he said. No relief, no triumph, just acknowledgement. The day of the gathering arrived, bathed in soft sunlight. Naomi dressed without strategy. No statement pieces, no armor disguised as elegance. She chose a linen dress that moved easily with her body, flat sandals, her hair left loose. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't ask how she would be perceived. She asked how she felt. "Calm," answered back. The yacht waited at the marina, white and gleaming against the water. Laughter drifted across the deck, easy and unforced. Naomi paused at the edge of the dock, breathing in salt and possibility. She didn't rush. When she stepped aboard, the shift was immediate. Conversations stalled. A laugh cut short. Someone's glass hovered mid-air. Naomi felt the attention land on her. Not heavy, not threatening, just surprised. She didn't shrink from it. She didn't perform for it either. She moved through the space the way she now moved through her life, with awareness, not apology. Whispers followed. She recognized a few faces, former acquaintances, people who had known her as someone else's wife, people who had opinions they believed were facts. She let them have their confusion. Julian stood near the rail, speaking with someone, his posture relaxed. When he sensed her presence, he turned, not startled, not guarded. His gaze met hers and softened. "You came," he said, as if the words carried no subtext. "I did," Naomi replied. No apology, no explanation. The simplicity of the exchange grounded her. Julian didn't hover. He didn't introduce her as anything other than her name. He didn't shield her or display her. He treated her presence as normal. That, more than anything else, disarmed the room. As the yacht eased away from the dock, Naomi felt a quiet steadiness settle in her chest. The water stretched ahead, open and unbothered. She leaned against the railing, letting the breeze lift her hair. Behind her, curiosity buzzed. In front of her, the horizon waited. She didn't feel like she had arrived to make a point. She felt like she had arrived because she belonged on her own terms. Naomi stood at the railing, watching the shoreline recede, feeling the hum of the engine beneath her feet. The yacht moved steadily forward, unbothered by the attention it carried. She let the rhythm anchor her, the way she had learned to anchor herself, through awareness, not resistance. Behind her, the whispers continued. Not cruel, no, kind. Curious, she caught fragments as they floated past. "I thought she left the tea. I heard it. It was sudden. Did you know she'd be here?" None of it startled her. What surprised her was how little it mattered. There was a time when she would have felt compelled to manage the room, to clarify, soften, explain, to make sure no one felt uncomfortable, even if it meant she did. Now, she let the discomfort exist where it belonged. Someone approached her with a cautious smile. An old acquaintance, someone she had once shared dinners with under different circumstances. "I didn't expect to see you," the woman said, carefully. Naomi returned the smile, calm and measured. "I like surprises." The response wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't defensive. It was simply true. The woman laughed, unsure how to continue, and drifted away. Julian checked in quietly, standing beside her without intruding on her space. "Are you okay?" he asked, low enough that only she could hear. Naomi nodded. "I am." He believed her without question. That trust, the kind that doesn't require proof, settled warmly between them. As the evening unfolded, Naomi moved through the gathering with ease she hadn't anticipated. She engaged in conversations when she wanted to. She stepped away when she didn't. Each choice reinforced something she had worked hard to reclaim: agency. Julian watched without hovering. When someone tried to pull Naomi into a conversation she clearly wanted to avoid, He intervened gently, redirecting attention without making a scene. Not as a protector, as a partner. Later, as the sun dipped lower, casting gold across the water, Naomi found herself laughing, genuinely, freely. The sound startled her at first. She realized how rarely she had laughed without checking who was watching. She caught Julian's eye across the deck. He smiled, not possessively, not proudly, just pleased. The contrast between this moment and the life she had left behind was stark. Not because one was extravagant and the other wasn't, but because one asked her to perform and the other didn't. She thought of the woman she used to be in spaces like this, careful, polished, always attuned to expectations. That woman had done her best with what she knew. Naomi didn't judge her. She thanked her quietly for surviving. As twilight deepened, Julian joined her at the railing again, offering a glass of water. "Still comfortable?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and meant it. He nodded. "Good." They stood together, watching the sky shift colors, the past loosening its grip with every mile they put between themselves and the shore. Naomi realized something then. This moment wasn't about shock, or spectacle, or reclaiming status. It was about showing up whole, without needing permission. The people who mattered saw it. The who didn't never had. When the yacht eventually slowed, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance, Naomi felt no urge to leave early or stay late. She was exactly where she wanted to be, for exactly as long as she wanted to be there. Julian turned to her, his voice thoughtful. "You handled that beautifully," he said. She shook her head gently. "I didn't handle anything. I just showed up." He smiled. "That's what I meant." Naomi smiled too. For the first time in a long while, the world had watched her without defining her, and she had let it. The test didn't arrive as conflict. It arrived as assumption. Life with Julian settled into a rhythm that felt natural, work balanced with time together, space honored without distance, affection expressed without obligation. Naomi moved through it with a sense of ease she had once believed was impossible. That ease, however, revealed habits that had nothing to do with Julian and everything to do with her past. The first sign appeared during a conversation about the future. Nothing formal, nothing urgent, just the kind of conversation couples have when something good has lasted long enough to imagine continuity. Julian spoke thoughtfully, outlining possibilities rather than plans. A potential move closer to the coast. A restructuring of work that allowed more flexibility. The ideas were offered, not imposed. Naomi listened, nodding slowly, and felt herself begin to disappear. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A familiar internal shift, the urge to align quickly, to reassure, to avoid slowing the moment with uncertainty. "Yes," she almost said. "That works," she nearly added. She caught herself mid-thought. Her body had tensed, shoulders lifting just slightly. The signal was familiar now. She had learned to listen for it. "Can we pause?" for a second, she said. Julian looked at her, attentive but calm. "Oh, course." Naomi took a breath. "I'm noticing something in myself," she said carefully. "I feel the urge to agree before I've really checked in. That's old for me." Julian didn't rush to respond. He waited. "I want to be honest instead," she continued. "I don't know yet what I want long term. Not because I don't care, but because I'm still listening to myself." The silence that followed was steady, not sharp. Julian nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." She searched his face for disappointment, impatience, withdrawal. She found none. "I'd rather know where you actually are," he said, "than have you meet me somewhere you're not ready to stand." Relief moved through her chest, quiet, expansive. Still, the moment lingered. Because even though Julian had responded with respect, Naomi felt the echo of an old fear. What if honesty eventually costs me this? The thought didn't spiral. It simply existed. Later that night, alone in her apartment, Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, reflecting. This was new territory. She wasn't reacting to someone else's behavior. She was confronting her own reflexes. Healing, she realized, didn't mean old instincts vanished. It meant you noticed them before they made decisions for you. The next test came from Julian's side. A few weeks later, he showed up distracted, not distant, but preoccupied. He checked his phone more often. He missed a planned dinner, rescheduling at the last minute. Naomi felt the old impulse to accommodate immediately, to say it was fine, even if it wasn't, to minimize her disappointment, to avoid appearing demanding. Instead, she named it. "I want to say something," she told him the next time they spoke. "When plans change suddenly, I feel unsettled. I don't need perfection. I need communication." Julian winced, not defensively, but thoughtfully. "You're right," he said. "I've been moving too fast lately. Thank you for telling me." He adjusted his behavior without fanfare. What surprised Naomi wasn't his response. It was how difficult it had been for her to speak. Even in a healthy relationship, self-respect required practice. Boundaries weren't a one-time declaration. They were a daily commitment to honesty, to presence, to staying awake inside your own life. Julian faced his own reckoning. He had spent much of his adult life operating independently, used to making decisions alone. Partnership required him to slow down, to consult instead of conclude. Naomi's clarity challenged him, not as criticism, but as invitation. They talked about it openly one evening, sitting across from each other, with tea growing cold between them. "I'm realizing how much I rely on momentum," Julian admitted. "When something feels good, I want to move forward quickly. Not to control, but to build." Naomi nodded. "And I'm learning not to confuse speed with safety." They smiled at each other. Different lessons, same direction. The relationship didn't fracture under the weight of these conversations. It reaped itself. That was the difference. No one withdrew. No one punished honesty. No one demanded certainty as proof of love. They learned how to hold both closeness and individuality at the same time. And in doing so, they discovered something rare. Love that grows not by crossing boundaries, but by respecting them. The moment that decided everything didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with a choice. Julian had been offered an opportunity, one that would expand his work significantly and require a major shift in lifestyle. It wasn't sudden, but it was substantial. When he told Naomi about it, he spoke carefully, aware now of the space between intention and assumption. "I want to be honest about what this would mean," he said. "It would change how we spend time together. And I don't want to pretend that doesn't matter." Naomi listened without bracing herself. That alone was progress. In the past, news like this would have triggered a familiar response. Adapt first, process later. She would have immediately rearranged her expectations, reassured him, minimized her needs. Instead, she paused. "I appreciate you telling me this before deciding," she said. "That matter to me." Julian nodded. "I've learned it." No. They sat in silence for a moment, not uncomfortable, but reflective. "I need to think," Naomi continued, "not because I don't support you, but because I need to understand what this asks of me." The words felt steady, leaving her mouth. Julian didn't rush her. He didn't interpret the pause as hesitation or rejection. "Take all the time you need," he said. That night, Naomi walked alone through her neighborhood, letting the cool air settle her thoughts. She wasn't afraid of the change itself. She was afraid of repeating a pattern, of shaping her life around someone else's trajectory without examining the cost. She asked herself the questions she had learned to trust. Does this align with who I am now? Would I choose this if no one expected me to? Can I remain whole inside this future? The answers didn't come immediately, and that, too, was okay. Over the next few days, Naomi noticed something different. Julian didn't fill the space with persuasion. He didn't sell the opportunity. He didn't frame it as inevitable. He waited. That waiting told her everything she needed to know about who he was becoming. When she finally spoke, it wasn't from fear or obligation. "I can support this," she said carefully, "if we approach it intentionally. If my work and boundaries remain non-negotiable. If we revisit this regularly, instead of assuming it works." Julian listened closely. "Yes," he said, "all of that." She studied him. "And if it stops working, then we address it," he replied. "Not you alone. Together." The answer didn't promise ease. It promised respect. In that moment, Naomi understood the difference between love that challenges boundaries and love that reshapes itself around them. This was not a repeat of the past, because she was not the same woman. Later, lying beside Julian, Naomi felt the unfamiliar comfort of knowing she hadn't sacrificed herself for closeness. She had brought herself fully into the decision. And Julian had made room. Conflict, she realized, wasn't the enemy of love. Avoidance was. What they were building wasn't perfect. It wasn't guaranteed, but it was honest. And honesty had become her most reliable compass. The relationship didn't survive because she endured. It deepened because they adjusted. In the quiet that followed, Naomi felt something settle inside her. Not certainty about the future, but confidence in herself. No matter what came next, she would not disappear to make it work. That knowledge changed everything. Naomi no longer measured her life by how much she could carry. That realization didn't arrive as a revelation. It revealed itself through ease. Mornings unfolded without urgency. Decisions were made with intention instead of reflex. When uncertainty appeared, she didn't rush to resolve it. She sat with it, trusting that clarity would come when she was ready to meet it. Her relationship with Julian settled into something that didn't need constant reassurance. They didn't perform happiness. They practiced presence. There were routines now. Shared walks, unhurried dinners, weekends that balanced togetherness with solitude. Neither of them mistook availability for obligation. Neither assumed closeness meant access. When Julian's work shifted, they revisited boundaries instead of letting them erode. When Naomi's commitments expanded, he adjusted without resentment. They checked in often, not to manage each other, but to remain aligned. "I want to make sure we're still choosing this," Julian said once, over coffee growing cold between them. Naomi smiled. "I am." The answer came easily. She noticed how different this felt from the past. There was no undercurrent of fear, no sense that honesty might destabilize what they had built. Their connection didn't depend on silence. It thrived on it. The kind of silence that comes from comfort, not avoidance. Naomi's work flourished in ways she hadn't anticipated. With her boundaries intact, her focus sharpened, she led projects without overextending. She delegated without guilt. She spoke clearly and was heard. People responded to the change. Some respected it immediately. Others tested it. Naomi remained steady through both. She no longer mistook resistance for wrongdoing. Not everyone was meant to have the same access. One evening, after a long day, Naomi and Julian stood on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker on. The air was cool, the moment unremarkable in every way that mattered. Julian reached for her hand, not to anchor her, but to share the view. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how different this feels from anything I've known." Naomi turned toward him. "Different? How?" "Balanced," he said. "Like I don't have to win anything to be here." She nodded. "Neither do I." They stood together, not merging, not drifting apart, just standing. Naomi reflected on the journey that had brought her here, not with regret, but with gratitude. She didn't wish she had learned these lessons earlier. She understood now that timing mattered. Growth arrived when it was ready to be honored. Leaving her marriage had not been an act of rejection. It had been an act of alignment. Love, she had learned, was not something you earned by enduring. It was something you cultivated by staying present and honest, first with yourself, then with another person. As the night deepened, Julian turned to her. "Whatever comes next," he said, "I want it to be something we decide together." Naomi met his gaze, steady and calm. "It will be," she said, "or it won't. But either way, we'll know we didn't lose ourselves to find out." The words felt complete, not final, not fragile, just true. The future did not arrive with promises. It arrived with consistency. Naomi noticed it in the smallest ways, in how Julian asked before assuming, in how she answered without rehearsing, in how neither of them felt the need to narrate their happiness for anyone else. They built a life that didn't look impressive from the outside. It looked honest. There were no grand gestures meant to erase uncertainty, no declarations designed to secure permanence. Instead, there were conversations that returned again and again to the same place. Does this still feel right? Most days, the answer was yes. On the days it wasn't, they talked. Naomi thought often about the woman she had been, the one who believed love was proven by endurance, by flexibility, by silence. She didn't judge that version of herself. She understood her now. She had been doing the best she could with what she knew. But she also knew this. She would never go back. Self-respect had changed the shape of everything. It had changed how she loved, how she worked, how she rested. It had taught her that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of alignment. Julian never asked her to be smaller. She never asked him to be less. That balance was not accidental. It was chosen daily, deliberately. One evening, long after the yacht had become a memory instead of a symbol, Naomi and Julian sat on the floor of her living room, sorting through old photographs. Some were from her marriage, some from earlier years, some recent. Julian paused over one of the older ones. Naomi stood beside Richard, smiling politely, perfectly composed. "You look far away," he said gently. Naomi studied the image. "I was." She didn't feel sadness looking at it, only recognition. She had traveled a long way to arrive back at herself. Later that night, as they prepared for sleep, Julian turned to her. "I want to say something," he said, "not because it needs to be said, but because I choose to say it." She listened. "Being with you has taught me that love doesn't need to rush to be real. It just needs to be honest." Naomi reached for his hand. "And being with you," she replied, "has taught me that honesty doesn't have to cost connection." They lay in comfortable quiet, the kind that doesn't ask for filling. Naomi felt no urge to define the moment, to capture it, to explain it. She had learned that the most meaningful things did not need to be announced. They needed to be lived. In the days that followed, life continued. Work, responsibilities, moments of doubt, moments of joy. Nothing was perfect. Nothing needed to be. Naomi understood now that love was not something that rescued you from yourself. It was something that met you after you chose yourself. And because of that, it lasted, not as a promise of forever, but as a commitment to remain whole. As she stood one morning at her window, sunlight stretching across the room, Naomi felt steady, not triumphant, not healed in a way that suggested an ending, just grounded. She had signed the divorce quietly. She had arrived without explanation. And in doing so, she had built a life that no longer required permission. That, she knew, was the real shock. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that love should never cost you your voice, your peace, or your sense of self, then let it travel further, like this video, so this message reaches someone who may be standing at a quiet crossroads of their own. And tell me in the comments, what did choosing yourself teach you about love? If you believe the strongest relationships are built on self-respect, honesty, and emotional maturity, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, where love stories don't glorify suffering. They honor growth. Until the next story, remember this: the love that lasts is the one that never asks you to disappear.